is we just demonstrated almost all of the different types of memory that we're going to talk about today. So our next topic is memory, and one of the main takeaways, we'll come back to this stuff, so keep that paper out so you can kind of check yourself later. One of the main takeaways I want you to get is that there are many different kinds of memory. And I think most of those were maybe a little bit obvious that I'm testing your memory in some way, but the jumping jacks I think is what threw you off. So I will say jumping jacks is a kind of memory that we will talk about. So we will first go through all these different kinds and talk about how they're different, talk a little bit about some of the brain areas involved in them. Another takeaway I want you to get from today is that memory is a very imperfect process of basically reconstructing information. So we tend to have this conception that memory is sort of like a video camera or something, that you're going around and your brain's just like recording things, and then whenever you have a memory, you're just sort of playing that video back. But it's not really like that at all. Memory is much more like your brain constructing a story from little bits and pieces of information that are real memories, but then filling in all of these gaps and, things with often like schemas and biases that are not correct and maybe not super helpful. And at the end, I'm going to give you some kind of study tips that are based on learning and memory that we talked about today, kind of our understanding of, from a perspective of a cognitive psychologist, like what are some ways that you can help increase your ability to learn and memorize information. All right, so to start, there are lots of different types of memory. I'm actually going to draw kind of a hierarchy up here on the board to sort of capture all of the ones that we'll talk about today. I'll put it here, and then can everyone see this board? That's probably better. Probably far enough away from my MacBook that this will not be recorded very well, but that's okay. So we have memory. We often think of it as kind of just like this one thing, but it's actually lots of different things. So first, we're going to split memory into what I'll call short-term, or we can also call this working memory. And then we have long-term, which I have that up there, but we'll kind of break down long-term more here. So these are all the types we'll talk about today. So first we're going to talk about there's different kinds of explicit memory. So explicit memory are memories that you can like verbalize, you can talk about easily, you can recall them consciously, basically, is another way you can think of explicit. And then we also have implicit memories. And implicit memories are much more unconscious. They're kind of hard to verbalize. So within explicit, we're going to talk about episodic memories and semantic memory. I know my handwriting is not the best, but implicit we could also break down into kind of multiple things, but the main one we're going to talk about today is what's called procedural memory. Okay, so just as we're talking about this, I want you to kind of have this hierarchy in your mind that this is sort of how all of this is organized or relates to each other. So we're going to start by talking about working memory. So there's kind of this concept, we have what's sometimes called short-term memory, sometimes called working memory. They're kind of the same, but not exactly. But I'm going to talk about them for this class as if they are, basically. So short-term memory or working memory is very, very short. So normally if someone says the word short-term memory kind of just in like colloquial language, they usually are talking about memory within like a day. But for a cognitive psychologist, short-term memory is much, much shorter than that. It's like 30 seconds long or less, okay? And working memory is basically your ability to kind of temporarily store and manipulate information. So the first task I gave you where I read you the numbers, that would be a very good example of like short-term memory, because I'm asking you to just remember something that I just said, within the past couple of seconds. So let's really quickly just kind of see how well you guys did on that. I'm going to read off the numbers again so you can see if you were correct, because again, you're supposed to put them in order. So the first one was 18736. How many of you got that one? Okay, the next one was 847619. How many of you got that one? Okay. And then 2325381. Anybody get that one? A few of you. We're up to 7. Okay, the next one is 43810765. Anybody? A few of you. Interesting. I think more of you got that one than the last one. And then the last one was 9842175546. Anybody get that one? All right. Congratulations, you are at the upper end of working memory capacity. So one of the things to know about all of these different memory systems is they have different capacities and different duration. So capacity refers to how much information that system can hold at any given time. So when we're talking about short-term memory or working memory, usually the capacity is like 7 items plus or minus 2. So most, kind of the average number of items that most people can hold in working memory is 7. The lower end, if you could only remember like 5 digits, you're still considered within like normal working memory capacity. And then the higher end would be 9 items. So I think we had one person who remembered 9 of those digits. Okay, so capacity of working memory is around 7 items. And then duration just refers to how long that information can be held without it being like updated, right? So if I told you, let's say I gave you a phone number right now and I want you to remember that phone number and you don't have your phone to program it in, you could theoretically just repeat that phone number in your head over and over again forever if you really wanted to. So the duration is more like how long can you hold it without that repetition process? Like how long will it just naturally stay? And when we're talking about short-term memory or working memory, it kind of depends, but I would say the duration is 30 seconds or less. Okay, so we'll kind of talk a little bit about that capacity and duration for some of the other systems as well. And so that was called a digit span, is the task I had you do where you just remember the numbers. The other one was the letters. So did any of you get any of the letters? You got 2 of them? 4? Okay. I'm going to read the exact same letters again, but I'm just going to change up my rhythm a little bit, and I want you to try again, okay? So same thing, I'm going to read the letters, and then I'll say go. All right, so CIA, LCC, RIP, FOMO, SOS, YOLO. Go. Still probably difficult, but maybe a little bit easier. All right. How many did you guys get that time? Did you at least get some of them? Someone got all of them? All right. So why was it so much easier the second time? Yeah. Yes. So all of them are an acronym that I hoped you might be familiar with. So CIA, LCC is the college we're at. RIP, like rest in peace. FOMO was the next one, FOMO. And then SOS. And then YOLO was the last one, right? So all acronyms you probably have heard at some point. So when I talk about the capacity and like number of items, it's a little tricky. Because like with the digits, you know, those numbers aren't related to each other in any way at all. So they're just kind of random numbers you're trying to remember. And the letters, the rhythm that I read them in the first time, I did it, you know, intentionally in a way where you wouldn't realize they're acronyms. But once you realize they're acronyms, instead of CIA being 3 items, it's like now it's 1 item in your brain, right? Instead of LCC being 3 items, it's 1 item in your brain. So you can do this process called chunking, is the name of that, where you basically take items and you try to group them in some way that makes them easier to remember. And that can kind of increase the capacity of working memory. Another task we did that was testing your working memory was the in-back thing, the thing where I had you banging on the table. So that one is probably a much better example of actual working memory because there's like this constant, the information's constantly being updated. You have to try to not just remember, but sort of choose what you're going to remember. So, you know, you want to remember the last shape, but then as soon as you're done with that, then you want to kind of dump that from your memory and move on to the next thing. So working memory is where you're not just remembering, but you're somehow manipulating that information in your mind as well. And the second part of that kind of demonstrated this fact that we have 2 main parts of our working memory. There is verbal working memory, which is, you know, mostly auditory in nature. Or you could maybe even just call this auditory working memory. It's usually referred to as verbal. But so whenever I had you do the dual thing, where you're doing the shape and the sound, I know it was a little bit more difficult, but I would say most of you were able to do it pretty well. If I instead had 2 shapes going at the same time, if I had 1 shape over here and 1 shape over here, and you have to like do something different for each shape, that would have been much more difficult, nearly impossible. Okay, and the reason is because you have these two separate parts of your working memory. One of them is handling auditory information, one of them is handling visuospatial information. So usually we can do two tasks at the same time as long as there's one of each. If you're doing one verbal task and one visuospatial task, we can handle that. But we cannot usually handle doing two visuospatial tasks or two verbal tasks at the same time. Yeah, Alex.
So every time I've heard about multitasking from anyone, like a psychology perspective, it's always, this is dumb, like humans are bad at it.
Yep.
You're going to be less effective at everything you're doing.
Yeah.
Is this kind of saying, well, in general maybe, but as long as one is specifically an auditory task and one is not specifically not an auditory task, we might actually be able to do that a little bit better?
Yes, exactly. So I would say there's definitely kind of this misconception around multitasking. In general, it is going to be a negative thing. Your performance on each individual task is going to suffer if you're doing both of them at the same time. But usually that's only true if they're in like the same domain. And oftentimes that kind of nuance is not talked about whenever you just read about multitasking online or whatever. So yeah, it's definitely true that if you're doing something verbal and something visuospatial, you usually can handle those both at the same time. And you probably all have experience of that. If you like draw, for example, and you have music playing in the background, like that's not going to interfere with each other at all. You can sit there and draw all day and listen to music. If you're reading and trying to listen to music, then you might have conflict there, right? If you just have music playing in the background and you're actively ignoring it and reading, you might be able to handle that reading. But there's no way you could read a book and listen to the lyrics of a song and like try to understand them at the same time, right? Because then they're both verbal in nature. So yeah, so in general, if you were working with kind of these two separate systems, then we can handle doing them both at the same time. Let's see, what else was I going to say about working memory? Out of all the memory systems that we'll talk about, I would say working memory is the one that's most highly correlated with intelligence. So in general, people who have really high working memory capacities or are very good at working memory tasks tend to, score higher on IQ tests and things like that. So it seems to be kind of a necessary component of intelligence, basically. All right, so that's working memory. Another thing I'll say, I didn't put it on the slides, but I'll just kind of mention it. Working memory is also really important for sort of controlling our attention. So people with ADHD, for example, sometimes have issues with working memory, and vice versa. People with working memory issues are more likely to have ADHD. So it's also involved in that kind of like trying to choose what am I going to pay attention to, where am I going to direct my attention, and then also like focusing and engaging in attention is part of working memory as well. All right, any questions about working memory? All right, so then we'll skip over to long-term memory. And we're actually first going to start with explicit memory. So again, explicit memory are things that we can easily verbalize and we can talk about. I could ask you a question about it and you would be able to just answer it verbally, basically. And again, there's two different types. So there's episodic memory and semantic memory. So these, I was testing you with those last two questions. So I asked you about like something you did over the summer. You don't necessarily have to share, but how many of you feel like you were able to remember like quite a bit of detail about that day? Like you could remember who you were with, kind of all the questions that I answered. Okay, so yeah. What do you think would happen if I had asked you, what was the most fun day that you had in the summer 10 years ago? Probably would not have been able, like maybe if you happen to know, like, okay, my birthday's in the summer and 10 years ago I would have been this age, and so on that birthday I did this, like you might be able to kind of figure out what you did through that kind of, process, but you're definitely not going to remember as much detail. So episodic memories are memories of the events from your own life. So if anyone's asking you about, like what you did or what you experienced, then that would be considered an episodic memory. It would also encompass things like, if you watched a movie, a couple days ago and I'm asking you details about that movie, that would also fall in episodic memory because it's like you would then have to episodic memory often involves almost like a mental time travel. It's like you're taking yourself, you're kind of mentally traveling back in time to that moment and remembering something from your own perspective, typically. So, here are some other examples of episodic memory. So like if I asked you what you ate for breakfast, what you did over the weekend, what you did on your 10th birthday. All of those would be considered episodic memories. And it's called episodic if it helps, because it's kind of like you're remembering episodes of your life, right? Like I'm going to rewind to episode, season 15, whatever, to this particular episode of my life. Let's see. The other type of explicit memory is semantic memory. And semantic memory is more like memory of general facts and also language. So when I asked you the capital of Washington, the capital of Iowa, and the first president of the United States, those would all tap into semantic memory. Did any of you know the capital of Iowa? Yes, it's Des Moines. I only know that because I lived there. I will tell you this is very embarrassing, but I didn't actually know what the capital of Washington was until like an hour ago. I had to look it up whenever I was like, okay, but I just moved here a couple months ago. I knew it was not Seattle. I knew but I wasn't 100% sure which city it was, so yeah. I'm guessing most of you probably knew who the first president of the United States was, hopefully. George Washington. Okay. So all of those questions are tapping into semantic memory, which again is kind of this memory of general facts and knowledge. Like when I ask you, what is the capital of Washington? There's nothing about you in that memory, right? There's no perspective that you have. Some of you can anybody remember when they learned the capital of Washington? Yeah. Do you want to share? You don't have to, but.
Yeah, it was, are you looking at me or
you both raised your hand. I was pointing at Devin,
okay,
but that's okay.
5th grade.
Okay. So you remember when?
Yeah.
Do you remember any details about it? Like, can you remember it in the same way that you remembered the fun day over the summer?
Only because my half-sister's aunt has a cupcake shop up there. That's the only reason.
So you maybe remember making like that connection in your brain, like, oh, I know that place from there. Yes.
I remember it very thoroughly because it made me mad because in 3rd grade we weren't allowed to go out to recess until we could, as a class, name off all of the capitals. And since my name starts with an A, I had to say like our state, and then it went down the list of states around us spreading.
Oh, right. Okay, yeah. All right. So you might have an episodic memory that's attached to that piece of information, but the piece of information itself would be considered a semantic memory. So yeah. Let's see, what else there is kind of this relationship too between these two. So kind of like you guys are talking about, often what happens is that episodic memories, if they're about kind of the same topic, they sort of fuse together over time to form a semantic memory. So, if I had asked you about this in 5th grade, the day after you learned about the capital of Washington, then all of you probably would have had an episodic memory of like, oh, I remember, the teacher was talking about it yesterday and I was wearing this, and you have all these like memories about it. But over time, as that information is like repeated, or you maybe actually interact with that information, maybe you go to Olympia, you spend time there, all of those episodic memories kind of fuse into one semantic memory of like, this is the capital of Washington. So there is a relationship between them, and it sometimes can be a little bit blurry, like the boundary between them, but they are definitely separate. One of the ways that we know that they're separate is that, first of all, they activate different parts of the brain. And if you have damage to certain parts of the brain, it can disrupt one of those types of memory, but not the other. So again, semantic memory also includes our memory of language. And so if you damage the parts of the brain that are involved in language, then you might lose the ability to talk or to understand language, but you still probably would have episodic memories. You might not be able to communicate them because you've lost language, but you still would have those memories of like, your childhood and what you did yesterday, etc. And vice versa. There are also instances where episodic memory can be disrupted, where people can lose, if you have like amnesia and you lose a large chunk of memory of something that happened in the past, you might still have language ability and be able to talk. You might still know those general facts and knowledge. There's also a type of amnesia that works kind of going forward instead of backward. It's called anterograde amnesia, which is actually the more common type of amnesia. So if you have damage to an area of the brain called the hippocampus, which we'll talk about more in a little bit, then basically what happens, people with that damage, they lose the ability to form new episodic memories. So after, like this usually happens if someone has a stroke or a car accident or something like that, after that accident, they basically will not be able to form any new memories going forward. So they might remember the stuff that happened before the accident, but, you know, they wouldn't remember stuff that happened after it. Does that make sense? So they kind of lose that ability to form new memories. Yeah.
Is this specifically with episodic memory or both?
Specifically right now, I'm talking about episodic memory. Damage to the hippocampus disrupts that.
Can a person with this kind of amnesia meet a new person, remember their name, and remember that they are designated as a friend at some point, but never actually remember their experiences with them?
Probably, they would not remember their name.
Okay.
So I know, again, that's where we get into kind of that blurriness of like, you would think someone's name might fall in semantic memory, but really like if you're meeting someone for the first time, then that name would be episodic, because it's kind of like you're remembering the perspective of I met this person and this was their name attached to this face. Does that make sense? But they would probably, if they have anterograde amnesia, the type I'm talking about, they would remember people before the accident, remember their names. But yeah, they wouldn't remember any interaction with them.
So that's like 51st dates where she wakes up and thinks it's October 4th.
Yes, yeah. I don't think I've actually like sat down and watched that entire movie, but I've seen enough clips of it to know, like, yeah. Let me think. Is there anything else I wanted to talk about there? I don't think so. So everybody understand the difference between these two? Okay. And again, those are both explicit types of memories, because I ask you those questions, you're able to just like answer them. All right, the one type of implicit memory that we'll talk about is procedural memory. And procedural memory was the jumping jacks. So procedural memory is also sometimes referred to as like muscle memory. So all of you, at some point learned to do a jumping jack. It's not like I had to teach you just now how to do it. You stood up and you knew exactly what to do and you did it, just fine without any issue. So you were remembering how to do that. So procedural memory is memory for performing skills. Like I said, it's muscle memory, so anything physical, like riding a bike or, playing a sport, lots of procedural memories go into that. But it's also important for some cognitive skills as well. So like if you think of someone who's a master at chess, for example, then they over time have kind of learned these procedures of like what moves to make in what context. And that's not necessarily muscle memory in the same way that a jumping jack is, but they're using that kind of cognitive procedural memory to be able to perform chess, essentially. So procedural memory is a type of implicit memory because it's difficult to verbalize. And let me just make sure this is super clear. So for example, if I asked you how to ride a bike, you do have, I would say, probably semantic memories of how to ride a bike, or maybe even episodic. You might tell me about a time when you were a kid and you learned to ride a bike for the first time. You might tell me okay, you need to sit on the bike, you need to hold the handlebars, you need to move the pedals with your feet. So all that stuff you can tell me, that is not procedural memory. That would be part of the explicit, episodic and semantic memory. But actually sitting down and physically being able to ride the bike, that would be procedural memory. So if someone had never rode a bike before and you tell them that information, it's not like that information alone is enough for them to get on the bike and then just ride it perfectly, right? They would have to actually practice the movements. So the actual muscle movements of riding the bike, that would fall into procedural memory. Let's see. Procedural memory mostly relies on an area of the brain called the basal ganglia, and then also the cerebellum. Okay, cerebellum is kind of like this. It almost looks like a second brain underneath your brain. It's like a little. I think cerebellum actually means little brain or something like that in French or something. And it's it sits kind of at the base of your brain. I have a picture of it later. But so cerebellum is really important for any sort of coordinated movement. Basal ganglia is kind of deeper. It's like a subcortical structure, kind of deep in the brain. That is also, it's mostly important for planning movement. So if you have damage to the basal ganglia, then you would lose a lot of those procedural memories. And again, you can have, patients who have particular types of damage where, if someone has damage to those areas that affect episodic and semantic memory, their procedural memory will be perfectly fine, still intact. One of the most famous patients who had the type of amnesia I was talking about earlier, he's named Clive Waring. If you're ever bored, I would recommend looking him up. There's a really good BBC documentary that's covers his disorder and his life. And so he had a type of amnesia that impacted his episodic memory, so he can't form any new memories going forward. His semantic memory was perfectly intact, so he could talk, he's very elegant in the way that he speaks. And he also played piano, which would be a type of procedural memory. And he had no issues, playing the songs that he had learned prior to his accident. I think he could actually even learn new songs as well after the damage to his brain. So again, through brain damage patients and things like that, that's one of the pieces of evidence that we have, that this is a separate memory system from the other ones.